Next up, we'd like to welcome science fiction writer Annalee Newitz. Annalee is the author of the book Autonomous, a winner of the Lambda Literary Award. Check out their book, Four Lost Cities, which is coming out in just a few weeks. Annalee is the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. They are the founder of the blog IO9, as well as the former editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. Annalee will be speaking to Torie Bosch, the editor of Future Tense, a joint collaboration between New America, Slate Magazine, and Arizona State University. Torie co-edited Future Tense Fiction, Stories of Tomorrow, which features Annalee's short story, When Robot and Crow Saved East St. Louis. I love that short story. Thank you, both of you, Annalee and Torie, for joining us today. You can turn on your cameras and please begin. And make sure you unmute. Yes.
Thank you so much, Vina. And hey, Annalee, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited for us to be here today among all of these brilliant young students. So everybody, congratulations on your projects and on making it this far. I think that we are the ones standing between the students and finding out who won. So we will make this as exciting a conversation as we can, knowing that you are hoping that our time passes very quickly. So Annalee, to start, like a lot of the students in the Biodesign Challenge, you actually don't have a hard science educational background to start with. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you became a science fiction author?
Sure. It is a long and winding path that involved a lot of academia. So I started out studying basically humanities and social science when I got my PhD at Berkeley. And I did a very interdisciplinary dissertation where I was looking at sort of images of science in pop culture and how the public understood those images in the context of various social movements. And I mean, basically it was just about monster movies, but there was this framework around it. And when I left grad school, I became very interested in writing about science and technology in the real world. And I went to MIT to do a science journalism fellowship through the Knight program, which is associated with their STS department and a lot of other projects at MIT where they bring together people from humanities and social sciences and the sciences. And I did that because I wanted to get a really good science education. I wanted to get it in the context of how I could talk about culture and society and the way technology impacts that and science. And I was particularly interested in bioscience. And so I had a lot of background with tech, and I just wanted to learn about the technology of our bodies and our relationship to the environment. And so I have worked my entire adult life as a science journalist and a technology journalist. So basically, it's kind of cheating if you want to be a science fiction writer, if you surround yourself with fascinating people who are doing cutting edge scientific work. Basically, I spent, 10 years just storing up cool shit in my head, including work like the stuff that David Benjamin is doing at The Living. I've been following his work for a really long time. And in fact, if you read Autonomous, there's definitely stuff that I stole from his brain in there because it's a future where biodesign is the norm. And people are using things like they're using foamers to make sidewalks. You have biodegradable sidewalks, biodegradable roads. You have homes that are made of living materials, sensors that are made of living materials. I love all that stuff. And it shows up in my science fiction all the time. So for me, the pathway really was sort of through a weird pathway that overlapped with humanities, with social science and science. And I think that, there's no real hard boundary between science and the humanities. Like we pretend there is because we want to believe that because we want to make academic departments that are kind of balkanized. But the fact is that science fiction and a lot of cultural work around science are part of the scientific project. And architecture can be part of the scientific project too. And so that's what really excites me, is like being at that kind of space in between many disciplines and telling stories about where that might take us as a civilization, or as civilizations, I should say. There's not just one.
Well, so I'm glad you mentioned autonomous because I think that we will talk a fair bit about autonomous and When Robot and Crow Saved East St. Louis, which I was thrilled to publish on Slate.
Yeah,
So
thank
maybe
you.
could you give us a really brief rundown of what each of those stories are?
Sure. So Autonomous is the story of a pharmaceutical pirate, and she's living about 150 years from now in a world where a lot of things are better or better in the sense for the environment than they are now. As I said, biodesign is kind of the norm. Sustainable energy is the norm. A lot of the problems that we're facing now around toxins in the environment are not completely solved, but they're being remediated on a wide scale globally. But the world that Jack, my pirate, lives in, because of course she's named Jack, she's a pirate. It's a world of hypercapitalism. And one of the things I wanted to really emphasize with her character, who has started as a synthetic biologist, she wants to bring medicine to everyone. She comes from a rural farming community, so she is very interested in helping people who aren't fancy rich people in the cities. And corporations just own everything. And the more that people have begun building with life forms, and the more that life forms have become something that we can manufacture, the more that capitalism has stretched out its tentacles to own those things. And so it's a world where essentially slavery has been reinvented under a very sanitized system, which they refer to as indenture. And it's also governments around the world refer to it as a kind of worker freedom, because you are free to sell your labor on the free market, and getting indentured is great because your company feeds you and they put you up, and what a good deal, right? Just 10 years, man. And then you're free. So I wanted to kind of show that, when we make strides forward in our discovery of how to use sustainable materials and things like that, we don't always fix all our problems. In fact, we can exacerbate social problems. And so Jack becomes a pirate because she realizes the only way to get expensive drugs to people who don't have a lot of money is to steal. And so she reverse engineers a lot of the drugs that corporations are making available, and either gives them away for free or sells them for cheap. And of course, it's a novel, right? So it's not just me sort of pontificating about like capitalism. So she infringes on a patent for a drug that pisses off a corporation, and they dispatch a very gender confused robot and her human companion to track Jack down. So it's a chase story. A lot of it has to do with the nature of being alive. And much of the book is from the point of view of the robot named Paladin, because paladins are awesome. Paladin is chasing Jack down. And so as Jack is figuring out more about this inequality in the world, Paladin is also, and of course, Paladin is owned by a corporation. So Paladin has to figure out what it means to be a life form that is also a commodity. So it's a fun book with chasing and robot sex, but it's also really about thinking about how just because you can build a building out of mycelium, which is so frickin' badass and such a wonderful vision of the future, that doesn't mean you're going to eliminate all of the problems we see with corporate ownership and corporate abuse.
And then can you give us a very quick précis of When Robot and Crow Saved East St. Louis?
Sure. This is a story with a talking crow, which is like one of my favorite things in the universe. So basically it's set in the near future. I wrote it a couple of years ago, and it's about a pandemic, or it's not a pandemic, it's an epidemic breaking out in East St. Louis in Southern Illinois. And the CDC sends out drones to do basically health surveillance and checking on who might be sick, and contact tracing and things like that. And so these drones are designed to be very cute. And I thought a lot about user experience design when I was doing it, because I was like, how would you make a drone that people would want to give spit samples to or blood samples to? It would have to be freaking insanely cute. It would have to be Wall-E. So basically it's a super, super cute drone. And its main superpower, other than taking saliva samples and other kinds of samples, is that it can very quickly, thanks to its programmer, learn different languages and learn sociolects. And so it addresses people in the language that they're most comfortable with, whether, like I said, that's a sociolect or a dialect or another language. And East St. Louis is incredibly multicultural. And so that's really required. And unfortunately, the CDC is shut down due to lack of funding. So Drone, the character robot, is on their own. And they wind up learning to speak Crow language and communicating with the Crows in East St. Louis. And the Crows actually identify an outbreak in progress because they figure out that people are getting sick and dying. And the Crows, why do they care? They don't really like people, but they really like our garbage. And so they're willing to kind of pitch in and help a little bit because we're part of their ecosystem, right? We're producing the waste that they love. So anyway, Crow and Robot work with a cute kid to help stop this outbreak with the help of a makerspace that is in the town, because there is no government help at this point. It's a little bit on the nose, even though I wrote it a couple of years ago. It's just sort of like the government says, screw it, there's nothing we can do. So they rely on this local nonprofit that can help them manufacture a just-in-time vaccine. And I based it on my experiences going to tons of amazing maker spaces and some biohacker spaces. And that's a big part of my work. I spend a lot of time talking to hackers and makers about what's possible. And so there's pretty much in every one of my novels and in many of my short stories, there's like little moments in hacker spaces or on university campuses where people are sort of effectively setting up these kinds of spaces. So I don't forget where I come from. There's always some academics in there doing good.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite parts of your work are the sort of joy of creation, sort of reflecting on how fun it is to just create things that haven't been done before and the camaraderie that comes up. And also just sort of the sense of playfulness and joy that comes in even the darkest stories. I mean, in some ways, parts of Autonomous and Robot and Crow are both, pretty depressing, but I came away from reading both of them, both when they were first published and again this week preparing for this conversation, with just sort of a sense of optimism and the reminder that the future will have moments that are wonderful even when things are scary. So could you maybe talk a little bit about how you work that sense of sort of delight into sometimes slightly dark settings?
Well, I am easily delighted. And I do take a lot of hope from the real world. A lot of the work that I did in Autonomous and a lot of my other stories came out of following iGEM, which is another very similar to the biodesign contest where students invent biotech, usually with an eye toward some kind of environmental remediation. And I also really believe that part of the role of science fiction is to get us thinking about, it's thought experiments, get us thinking about where we want what we're building in the labs to take us. And dystopian science fiction, we all know exactly why that's there. A lot of us have read 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale. These classic works of dystopia are signposts saying, don't go here. Just like see all of these trends that are happening right now. Like this is where they will lead. This is terrifying. Don't do that. We need to stop. But we also need the other side of that, right? We need stories about, okay, well, once we stopped The Handmaid's Tale, well, where do we go? And so I don't believe in utopia. Like I don't write anything where stuff is perfect. As I just mentioned, like, we get our perfect ecotopia future, but then there's slavery. So there's never a happy, perfect ending. But I do think that even writing a story where there are progressive changes in culture, even though there's, drawbacks, feels utopian at this point, especially right now. And so I really do make a conscious effort to focus on characters who are trying to fix things, people who become pirates when they realize that they can't work within the system, or people who become subversives because they realize that their environmental work is actually connected to a larger colonial project, which is part of what I'm working on right now in a novel. And I think, in a sense, I try to keep realism in there because instead of just taking you into a perfect utopia where we're all like blissed out and everything is perfect, because I do want it to be a roadmap. I want people to understand, like, even if you come up with a solution, you're just going to create more problems that you'll have to grapple with down the road. But I focus on characters fixing things. I focus on characters forming alliances and friendships, even if it's non-human characters, which happens quite often in my work these days. And I really want people to come away from my work feeling like there actually is something they can do, even in really dark times. And I think, we're living through an incredibly great example of that happening in real life, where we've had a lot of adversity. There's been so much reactionary cultural, let's just say, we've had a lot of reactionary cultural moments, both in the United States and across the world, with the rise of populism and authoritarianism. And yet we've also seen, at least in the United States right now, we're seeing some of the most hopeful forms of uprising that I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen so much, hope and people putting their lives on the line to show that they want a better world. They want a better world for people who've been marginalized and for people who've been victimized. And so even in dark times, things like Black Lives Matter can happen. And that's part of what I want people to remember, because it's sometimes hard. Sometimes it's very easy to go down the dystopian route. It's really satisfying because when you hate what's happening in your world, you want to burn it all down. Totally understandable. But if you burn it all down, you wind up with just ashes. And so I want us to try to think together, whether through fiction or nonfiction or through building freaking awesome buildings, about how we can actually walk through this thorny path and like maybe make it to a place where things are better for everyone and there's justice as well as super badass buildings.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about your work is that you're creating futures that I can imagine myself living in. It's hard to imagine living in a dystopia because it doesn't feel sort of human somehow, but I can see myself in autonomous in 150 years.
I hope we're all there, except
yes.
without the slavery.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would prefer not, or the corporate control, but
yeah,
the advances in biomaterials and pharmaceuticals would be fantastic for everybody.
Yeah.
I think you talked about alliances in your stories, and one thing I think we've all been thinking about a lot is sort of the challenge of competing for different types of justice, and times when it feels like things can be at cross purposes. So in autonomous, there's a couple of different major veins. There's the fight for equitable access to healthcare for everybody, and then there's the fight for autonomy for every sentient creature, be they human or machine or something altogether different. And I think in some ways, there's a tension there. I think also we're seeing a similar tension right now with both the pandemic and this new renewed struggle for civil rights happening right now. Can you talk a little bit about competing areas of activism and how they can work together in your stories and in real life?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In Autonomous, and also in Robot and Crow, in a lot of my books, I have characters who are trying to change the world for the better, who are, for lack of a better term, just clueless about the larger context of how injustice is happening, or they're just clueless about other kinds of injustice. So my pharmaceutical pirate, Jack, she really understands how intellectual property law deprives people of healthcare. And it's something that's a life or death issue. It's not theoretical. She's seen people that she loves die, and she wants to stop that. At the same time, she grew up enfranchised. She's never known anyone really who became indentured. She has kind of vague memories of growing up in Saskatchewan, where lots of Indigenous kids became indentured, but she didn't really think about it. She just sort of was like, oh, well, that's just normal. And eventually she meets someone who grew up indentured, and that person is like, hey, patents are bad, but you know what's really bad? It's really bad when you're a living being who's owned, not just a medicine that's owned. And it really changes Jack's perspective, and it actually causes her to clean up her act a little bit. And one of the things I like to think about is, how do these kinds of in our real world, how do these different kinds of movements talk to each other? Because we do have movements around civil rights, gaining more rights for people who have traditionally been oppressed and locked out of many of our powerful institutions. But then we also at the same time have the struggle for things like improving the environment, or improving access to property, intellectual property, things that, or scientific, movements to make scientific research more open. And these things can sometimes feel really removed from each other. If you're marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter, that feels really immediate and human. Whereas, arguing in a boardroom that we have to be careful with biased algorithms in our artificial intelligence or in our machine learning feels really kind of like, how is that really doing anything? Like, how is that, how are these the same struggle? But they are. They're very much connected, because it's all about self-determination and living in balance with each other and living in balance with the environment. And all of that stuff can come together. There's a great documentary that just came out called Coded Bias that does a fantastic job thinking about the connection between developing algorithms, in the lab, and how that's connected immediately to social justice issues around race and gender. And I think I guess what I would say is that it's an ongoing struggle to try to bring things together like that. Like, many of us are fighting for justice in very different rooms, and we often forget to listen to each other. And this is also a lesson that goes back to what we started with interdisciplinary scholarship and interdisciplinary work, where we have this idea that, like, science is here, technology is here, culture and society are over here. And like, you just can separate them out and they can just go along their way and they have nothing to do with each other at all. When in fact, they're deeply connected and they're always changing each other. And if you walk into a living building, which I really hope we will one day, that's going to change your understanding of nature. It's going to change your understanding of your relationship to other people. It's not going to be just a technical achievement. It's going to be a lot more than that. And I think that as we, as you guys look to the future of where your technologies will go and where your ideas about how to play with biology and novel materials go, I mean, it's always important to think about them as embedded in cultural relationships. And having looked at some of the projects that have come out of this biodesign challenge, I can see people are already doing that. They're thinking about face masks and homeless shelters and how to, design filters so that a place like Flint, Michigan never happens again. Or what happened with their water. Flint can stay. We just don't want the lead in the water. And so I think that's part of storytelling, but that's also part of inventing real life objects.
We only have a couple more minutes, so I have two final questions for you real quickly.
Sure.
The first is, can you maybe talk a little bit about sort of longer term thinking and innovation versus shorter term thinking and innovation? Do people have to decide to focus on one at the expense of the other?
Definitely not. And I think, again, this is sort of picking up the thread of imagining your work in the context of society or in the context of culture. You have to imagine your work in the context of the next 5 years, but also the next 100 years or the next 1,000 years, especially if you're interacting with the environment. Because as we know, carbon cycles are long. And what we do on the Earth now will be affecting people in 1,000 years. When I first started covering climate science, I talked to a geologist who studies 3 billion year old rocks. So he's really focused on the 3 billion year ago phase. And we were talking about carbon cycling and how the Earth has been through lots of phases of high carbon. And I said, so what are we looking at now? Like with how we've perturbed the carbon cycle as humans, what's the outcome? And he gave me this sad stare and he said, oh yeah, things are going to be messed up for at least 1,000 years. Just, bottom line. So we have to be thinking about that and telling ourselves stories about how our work might impact people in 1,000 years, while at the same time remembering you have to survive, you have to make a living, you have to build things now for people around you now. But I do think that storytelling, whether you're telling the story or you're reading other people's stories, really helps with that. It really helps to empathize with people in the future. It's a big part of my science fiction. I'm working on an epic now about terraforming that's a multi-generational epic about people who are changing their environment, but trying to keep the carbon cycle balanced and trying to keep the environment diverse and keep the human footprint small. And it really helps me just to be able to say like, well, and then 1,000 years later, this happened. And so while we can't ever experience that realistically until we have time travel or infinite life, we can think about it logically through stories.
Yeah, I cannot wait to read the new novel.
I can't wait to be done.
Would you just hurry up, Annalee?
I know.
All right, my last question before we wrap up. So, one thing we see in autonomous that feels really relevant to the biodesign challenge is that Jack is faced with, she has this wonderful idealism, and she gets a little bit frustrated with her peers when they leave college, as people start to sort of make allowances or work with the system that she fought against so hard. And could you talk a little bit about how, as our students are leaving the university, how they can sort of retain that sense of idealism in themselves and still make things happen? You have about 45 seconds to
Great.
to decide
Okay.
this, yeah.
So edibles. Okay. Sorry. Again, it's hard because as soon as you hit your head up against the real world, like you realize like, oh, everything takes way longer to change. We actually are looking at 1,000 years, not 10 minutes. But I think the best way to do it is to constantly be talking to people outside your narrow discipline. For me, that's always the thing that's reawakened my enthusiasm about the future and my sense of possibility. So if you're working on mushrooms, talk to somebody who works on bacteria. If you're working on bacteria, talk to somebody who works on trees. Or if you're working on architecture, talk to somebody who writes books or talk to somebody who does public transit. It's really important for us to be thinking about the big picture, especially with design, because you're talking about creating objects, creating buildings, creating technologies that many, many, many people will use. You have an audience in the same way that celebrities have audiences. People who make objects that we use every day, like phones or doorknobs or like just really badass doors. I do a lot of walking around my neighborhood right now, so I'm really appreciating doors as like an interface because they really are. You're interacting with so many people, and so it's important to remember who all those people are and how they might be using your shit in ways that you didn't expect. When people adopt technologies, look, all I could think of when I was getting excited about mycelium bricks was like, and it'll be used for porn, and it'll be used for all kinds of activities that we didn't expect. It's like, yes, of course it will be amazing for bricks, but what else will people do with it? I'm sorry to pick on the mycelial bricks, but I'm just like, they're so rad.
They're so cool.
I want a house made of them. And so I think, again, storytelling is helpful for that, but also talking. I really believe that the smallest unit of hope is friendship and allyship. And so just making sure that you're like, if you're getting way too deep into pessimism and dystopia, just talk to someone who's an expert on something else and get them to just tell you a freaking cool story about something that they discovered or that they know about. And it might give you just a tiny, tiny bit of hope.
I'm writing down the smallest element of hope is friendship, because that's just so beautiful.
It's true. I mean, it's
Yeah.
always, for me, it's always been the thing that's been the saving grace. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I could keep talking to you for about an hour, but I think the students want to take their break and then find out who won. So
I want to know
thank
who
you
won
so much.
too. It was so awesome. You guys rock. So go out there and make the world more awesome and more biotechnological instead of just like what it is now.
Thank you, Biodesign Challenge.
Thank you, Annalee and Torie. Yeah, that was wonderful. I think we tell our students to really think about context often, right? And working across disciplines. And it's so validating to hear people that are, in the world doing it right now talk about it as well. And great pieces of advice as well. So thank you again.